David Miliband, great to see you on the show again.
Great to be with you, Ian.
So a bunch of things to talk to you about. First, 50,000 plus dead from these horrible earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. Talk to me a little bit about how aid is getting to the people on the ground that really desperately need it.
Yeah, thanks for keeping some attention on this 3 weeks after the earthquake, because the great danger is that the world moves on. You said 50,000 dead. It must be at least double that. I think that must be a huge undercount, the 50,000 figure, because you'll have seen the pictures that the rubble is still there, and I'm afraid there are bodies still there. But obviously there are millions still alive, 4.5 million in the northwest of Syria under the control of armed opposition groups, opposition to the al-Assad regime in Damascus, and 15 million in the affected area across southwestern Turkey, part of an 80 million population of Turkey as a whole. How does aid get to those affected? Well, inside Turkey, it's pretty straightforward. It's within their own country. But in the northwest of Syria, it's much more difficult. We, the International Rescue Committee, my organization, has about 450 staff on the ground in the northwest of Syria. We tragically lost 2 colleagues in the earthquake itself. And they are still waiting for cross-line aid. And although there are 2 more cross-border points, we haven't really seen an increase in the aid flows. We haven't yet had the full monthly figures. But the latest data I saw says that it's still very tough to get aid across the border.
And once it gets across the border, what sort of confidence do we have that the Assad regime will actually allow the aid to get to where it needs to go?
Well, very low for aid that's going into Damascus. I mean, that's basically staying within government-controlled areas. For aid that's coming cross-border into the northwest of Syria, then it's out of the control of the Assad regime. And the question then is, are you sure it's going to reach the people who need it? And our experience, we've been in northwest Syria over the last 12 years, is that it does reach people in need. And they make a real noise if it doesn't reach them. Our own tracking, but also our own client surveys show that what aid does come through does reach them. Obviously, some of the aid we give is cash support, which allows people to purchase in the open market. And there are commercial goods flowing across borders, but that doesn't really help you that much when it comes to medicines and some household appliances. So the humanitarian situation was in crisis before the earthquake.
Yes,
it's been doubled by it.
Yeah, you referred to it as a double crisis in Syria. And of course, I mean, when you talk about the environment for the Syrian citizens, especially those in the north, I mean, it's not. You've had all sorts of difficulty just in creating conditions for normal day-to-day life. So it's hard to imagine what happened as a consequence of the earthquake.
Yes, I mean, if you're on the precipice and there's an earthquake, you're off the precipice, and really, you're in the lap of the gods whether you survive. Frankly, survival is success for the next couple of weeks. It's still cold, so winterization is one of the major needs. There are enormous risks for some kids who've lost parents, obviously. There's the danger that the World Health Organization have warned of a secondary crisis to do with disease, not just untreated injuries from the earthquake, but cholera returning. There was a cholera outbreak in January in the northwest of Syria. So it's a dire situation. And you will know as well as I that the overall politics for northwestern Syria are as dire as the humanitarian situation. It was a conflict zone as recently as January, bombing raids from Russian and Syrian aircraft, shooting. 150 civilians were killed last year in border skirmishes. There's no UN process that's got leverage at the moment for the political situation. Russia, Iran, Syria, and Turkey is really in control of the politics. And if you live there, it's very hard for people to keep up any hope at all.
So let's move to Turkey, where, of course, the majority of the casualties we know about, large majority, are actually located. I want to ask you, how much of this do you think was preventable? There's been a lot of criticism of the fact that building standards were nowhere close to what they needed to be. I mean, was this something that corruption played a big role, poor governance played a big role in just how bad this crisis has become?
Well, I'm not a structural engineer, so I'm not going to claim expertise where it doesn't exist, and I can't say to you that I've been through all of the different planning permits and building regulations, never mind the architectural designs. What you're obviously speaking to, though, is that Turkey had experience in the late 90s of an earthquake, which led to all sorts of promises about building standards, but clearly from the...
Also led to the ouster of a prime minister at the time, right?
That's a good
poorly
point,
handled it back then.
That's a very good point. But you've obviously seen these buildings just absolutely cratering. And so what I can speak to from our, we work through partners, just to be clear, in Turkey, it's not direct IRC delivery. We're working through partner organizations, Turkish partner organizations, through our office in Gaziantep, the center of the earthquake. What we know is that there's been an absolute meltdown of the urban environment. And there's a lot of anger about that, understandable, as well as grief. But I can't speak to you about corruption in respect to the planning permit system. But what we both know is that Turkey is just a few months away from an election, and an accident, an earthquake as grave as this, and the response to it is going to play a big part in that election. I'm presuming you think the election will go ahead as planned, but there are 10 million people whose lives have been turned upside down, so it's hard to see how they're going to vote and participate.
The first thing I thought of when I saw all of this outrage in Turkey is, to what extent are we just seeing a government that just doesn't care the way it needs to about its own population? And again, as you see tens and tens of thousands that are probably still dead under that rubble, it's just hard not to ask those questions. The election's going to be very relevant.
Yeah, I mean, look, they're all voters. So I think that, and Turkey is a functioning democracy, albeit one that's been highly centralized over the last 20 years, increasingly centralized. But the response now is twofold, isn't it? Or threefold, in fact. One is about survival, secondly is about recovery, and thirdly is about blame. And that's going to play out in Technicolor in Turkey.
I want to talk about another tragedy, this one playing out not just today, but over many, many years now, which is that of the migrant crisis in Europe. Yet another boat, death toll risen to 64 right now, lost at sea off the coast of Italy, what's being called, and I quote, the voyage of death. We know that smugglers were charging some 8,000 euros apiece to get a ride on that boat. And I'm wondering to what extent you agree with what we're hearing from European leaders, that the most humane thing to do is to stop migrants from risking their lives in the first place. How do you respond to these tragedies?
Well, I think that you have to respond before they happen. Look, the big picture is not just a European picture, it's an American picture as well, which is that more people are on the move than ever before. And more people are on the move for, if you like, political reasons, not just economic reasons. Political in the sense of they're fleeing persecution, they're fleeing war, or they're fleeing disaster. And that's evidently true in Europe for people fleeing from the Middle East and North Africa. It's true in the US for people fleeing from the northern triangle of countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, but also 5 million refugees from Venezuela, etc. And both Europe and America face the challenge of richer countries, which is, how do you distinguish between refugees on the one hand and immigrants on the other? A refugee is someone who has no home to go to. An immigrant is someone who's choosing to leave their home. How do you balance fairness with humanity to make sure that you are fulfilling legal as well as moral obligations for people who've been driven from their homes? And how do you balance international responsibility with local responsibility? My recipe for that involves the following elements. Element one, you have to have fast processing of asylum claims. If you don't have fast processing of asylum claims, America's taken an example, 2, 3, 4 years to process an asylum claim because there's a backlog of over 1 million people in the immigration courts. You can't do justice and you can't achieve fairness or humanity. Secondly, those who are allowed to stay need to be properly integrated into the society, above board, given training, given language, tuition, able to participate fully in society. Those who fail the test obviously can't stay. Third element of this is to recognize that there's a very strong criminal element that's exploiting the absence of legal routes to get into Europe or America. And in Europe, we've got very good evidence of this. There isn't an EU agreement on its asylum and migration package. And so there aren't safe and legal routes to flee from persecution or disaster. That just plays into the hands of the people smugglers. And I think they were in your mind in some of the way you phrased your question. The fourth element that I think is important is that you have to have legal routes to asylum and to immigration. The Biden administration has made a nod towards this in its pledge that 30,000 people a month from Haiti, Venezuela, etc., 4 countries in total, will be allowed into the United States if they're able to register before they arrive. And so those are some of the components that are necessary in addressing what I think is going to be the challenge for the rest of this century, frankly, because we know from the data, the econometric data, that in countries of less than $7,000 a head, people are going to want to leave. Interestingly enough, all European countries are doing well for Ukrainian refugees. They're integrating them and they're giving them, they've set the standard.
I've heard that several million that went to Europe already in the first year have returned to Ukraine. Do you believe that part of the success is because it's new and it's meant to be transitory? Do you think that you'll start to see a very different story if this goes on for 3, 5 years?
Well, people were asking that 6 or 9 months ago. And I think that the fears that as weeks turned into months and months turned into years, there'd be a backlash, that hasn't actually happened. I mean, a country like Poland, which is bearing a huge share of the responsibility, people are still living in each other's living rooms. There's still the support going on. One factor that this brings out, of course, is that if countries don't share the burden, that is absolute grist to the mill of those who would want to exploit the situation. And that's been a big problem in Sweden over the years, that Sweden has felt it's taking a disproportionate share compared to other countries in Europe, countries like France.
And it's affected Swedish politics, absolutely.
Exactly. And so you've got to share out the burden. You've got to share out the responsibility. The 27 countries of the EU did that in the Ukraine crisis. Now, you asked about people going back. We have IRC teams, International Rescue Committee teams in the east of Ukraine, as well as in Poland and Germany. Here's what we're seeing. There were 6, 7, even 8 million people who'd crossed at one point, but 2 or 3 million then went back last July, August, September. However, some of those have now come back into Europe. And I think what we've got to get used to is people moving backwards and forwards as the war develops and as the front lines change. Obviously, it's asymmetric. There's a intense trench warfare in the east of the country, but there's missile attacks from Russia elsewhere in the country, and the trauma associated with that is real for the women and kids who are obviously not conscripted. They're the refugees. But there were, to answer your question directly, there were a couple of million people who did go back to Ukraine last year.
So before we close, David, I have to ask at least one question about Brexit. I mean, we're years through this process, and finally there is a deal agreed to on Northern Ireland and trade with the continent. You in favor of the way that the UK PM, Rishi Sunak, has handled this? And can we finally actually close this chapter, this unfortunate chapter on UK history?
Yes, I do support the new deal. It's not the first deal. It's a new deal. It's a more honest deal than the previous ones. But no, we can't close the book because Brexit is never over. It's a journey, not a destination. And it's forever. It's in its impact. And it's still playing out because obviously Northern Ireland is the, if you like, the apex of the problem because the Northern Ireland situation is so unique, and because the Good Friday Agreement that we'll celebrate in April 25 years ago was based on the fact that Britain and Ireland, both Britain and the Republic of Ireland, the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland, were both in the European Union. And that's what allowed the Good Friday Agreement to say that those living in Northern Ireland could be British or Irish or both, and they could choose themselves. That's been interrupted by Brexit. But obviously there are swathes of other aspects of national life where Brexit isn't working, and that needs to be addressed too.
David Miliband, we'll have you back. Got to keep talking about it. Thanks so much, man.
Thank you.